Hi KRB teachers, welcome to the second webinar in the Maximinds Mental Health webinar series. Today we are looking at mental illness and understanding the prevalence of disorders, particularly in teenage girls. A trigger warning just to start with, this particular webinar will reference things like suicide. The content is sensitive and may cause harm and distress, so please do feel free to turn it off. A reminder that I am a psychologist and I will have my contact details up at the end in case you would like to reach out to me as well. So a reminder as to the 8 series webinars. The one today we are focusing on is mental illness. So getting straight into it, what are we hoping to learn about today? What is mental illness? What are the most common types of mental illness, particularly in teenage girls? What is the impact of mental illness? What is stress and how does that differ to anxiety? What are depressive disorders? What are behavioural disorders? And what are eating disorders? These are the ones that we've chosen to focus on, mainly because of their prevalence and also in terms of ones that I think are relevant, obviously, to teenage girls and our KRB students, and also increasingly common that I'm finding as a practitioner in dealing with for my clients. So just to give you an overview of what today looks like, we'll be going through definitions, looking at the prevalence, why is it important to understand the impact of mental illness, looking at stress and anxiety, depression, ADHD, and eating disorders, and then have a summary and refer you to further resources. Just to start with, there is one quick question. If you can please scan the QR code and answer that, that would be excellent. Again, it will help for you to reflect on your learnings, of which hopefully there'll be many for today, to compare at the end. So if you could please just answer that one question, I'll just give you a few seconds. Thank you very much. Again, that really does help with feedback and for yourself. So starting today with definitions of mental illness. As a reminder, I'm a psychologist and we have a team of psychologists. And how do we know what mental illness is and how we are all taught it as psychologists is we use something called the DSM, which is the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness Disorders. How they define it is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance, and I'll talk about what that means, in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior, reflecting a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or development processes underlying mental functioning. Mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress or disability in social, occupational, or other important activities. So that's a lot going on there, and I'll leave that there for you to reflect on. On the flip side, what a mental illness is not. So it's not an expectable or culturally proved response to a common stressor or loss, such as the death of a loved one. It is not socially deviant behaviour alone and conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society, unless that deviance or conflicts results from a dysfunction in the individual as described above that we just looked at before. So to summarise that for you, mental illnesses cause clinically significant distress. That means it must interfere with life functioning, either at home, school, or both in the case of children. They're enduring, so they're not just from a point in time, as mentioned in the definition, not just from a death of a loved one, although that can cause a period, does not necessarily denote it's going to be a mental illness. Must be professionally diagnosed, not Googled or seen, unfortunately, as we're currently seeing a lot of, seen on TikTok, and self-diagnosis there. Mental illnesses are more than just naughty, inappropriate, or socially deviant behaviour. But again, this can be indicative of what we'll look at, which is oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder, which is common, particularly in boys. As you may remember from last week, Maximinds defines mental health in terms of 3 dimensions: being in control, being in the present, and also being in touch with reality. On the flip side of that, then, mental illness is obviously the absence of these things. So, for example, in terms of control, on the flip side, mental illness, we define it as having a sense of helplessness, and this is something called learned helplessness. So when there's this perception that it doesn't matter what they do, there is no way that they can have an impact on their future. There's that no sense of agency or autonomy, which can cause mental illness. The second dimension is not being in the present, particularly being focused on the past, which is where, as we spoke about last week, typically depression can sit, or focused on the future, which is typically where anxiety sits, or it could be a combination of both of those things. And the third dimension of mental illness is not being in touch with reality and instead being delusional. That in the extreme is where we get things like psychosis, things like you may have heard of schizophrenia, bipolar, when they're totally out of touch with reality. We don't cover those particular ones today just because of the prevalence is not typically very high, but that is something that is, I think, particularly comes from that sense of delusion for those mental illnesses. Caveat though, mental illness is not just the absence of mental health. So even though I've showed you a simplistic high-level version, it is important to know that both mental illness and mental health can go on a continuum, and you can have, for example, a high level of mental health, but a high level of mental illness as well, and that could result in, for example, struggling. The similar vein, you could have a low level of mental illness, but a low mental health, and that could be languishing. Obviously, the worst case scenario is having high mental illness and low mental health, and that's floundering. But because we're focused on positive psychology here, the optimal state is obviously having a high mental health and low mental illness, and that's where we really flourish. So as we spoke about last week, what determines mental health? In the same vein, what determines mental illness is a product of nature and also not nurturing environments. So for example, for nature, genetic predispositions, family histories, is there already depression in the family? Does even an auntie or an uncle, by extension, have any of the mental illnesses that may be predisposed for a particular child? There's also neurobiological factors, typically abnormalities in brain structure, chemistry, and functioning. Also, it's the absence of a nurturing environment. Things like trauma. We have found a big impact of domestic violence on mental illness. Things like even divorce and family breakdowns, even something like a car crash that could lead to things like post-traumatic stress disorder. It's also the result potentially of abuse and neglect, having dysfunctional home environments, and also stressful environments, which can be at home and or school. So this as teachers is obviously really important, again, to remind you that it's about nurturing the student and providing that nurturing environment, and where possible, minimizing those stressful environments that can exacerbate or unmask mental illness. So what are mental illnesses? And these are a few that you may have heard of, and I've already probably mentioned a couple. So we will be looking today, as I mentioned, at anxiety. We will not cover bipolar, but you may be familiar with that. Eating disorders, obviously increasingly prevalent, I think, amongst young people, personally dealing with, but also we know from statistics. ADHD, again, another one that is very common, we will be exploring today. Post-traumatic stress disorder, I mentioned that, can typically come from a post-trauma. Conduct disorder, which we'll be discussing as part of behavioural disorders. OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, it's a type of anxiety. Depression, which we will be exploring, and autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, as you may be familiar with. So the likelihood of at least one student at Kincoppal having any one of these is very high collectively. But the more common ones, as I've mentioned and touched on, is anxiety, depression, ADHD, and conduct disorder. So to categorize those disorders: emotion disorders, anxiety and depression; behavior disorders, ADHD, conduct disorder, and oppositional defiant. And we will be covering those too. And also then eating disorders: binge eating as the most common type of eating disorder, but also bulimia, and then anorexia nervosa. So these are the ones that we'll be covering today. So let's get to the prevalence of mental illness. So how common really is mental illness, particularly in our young people and students at Kincoppal in high school? Overall, the latest statistics we have is that 2 in 5 young Australians experience mental illness each year. As you can see, there's the 2 in 5. They're from 16 to 24. We have slightly older demographics here because studies on younger populations, particularly in the earlier years of high school, are not done as frequently. But that does give you an overall indication that it's much higher at that 16 to 24 years compared to the 25 to 34 and the 35 to 44. And as you'll see, that trend does continue. The older people get, the more infrequent mental illness becomes. Unfortunately, because of COVID, the projected increase of mental illness is rising. And this is because when we have a traumatic event, such as in Australia, like the things like the floods, the COVID, obviously, which we've just experienced, or any other sort of natural disaster or national pandemic that we may have had or will have, typically we don't tend to see the impact of those traumas, the research says, for at least 18 months afterwards. So as you can see, the comparison between the 2020, which is when these studies close to then they were done, they're actually 2022, just last year, but the projected is then by 2030, based on that increase, would typically sit at about almost 1 in 2, but unfortunately because of COVID might be even exacerbated even more. So that 2 in 5 potentially could be as high as 3 in 5 within the next 5 years. Something quite probably scary to think about for you as teachers. And what does that mean for the KRB girls, and how can we start fostering those nurturing environments that we talked about in order to help minimize these things, but also deal with the increasing rise of mental illness disorders? So to look at how that breakdown occurs in children. So as mentioned, studies looking at younger populations don't happen as often. This was one to show you from 2013 to 2014, so 10 years ago, and I will show you then how this compares to today. Anxiety at that stage for children, and particularly girls, was at 8%. Depression was found to have 6%, ADHD 3%, and conduct disorder 2%. So not hugely significant numbers even 10 years ago. Obviously 8% or 1 in about 11 having anxiety is still a big proportion of your students, potentially 2 in every class that you might have, for instance. What that looks like today, or at least the latest studies that we have that came out this year, was based on a study done by the Black Dog Institute and found that levels of anxiety, to compare, are now at 27% for girls, depression's at 19%, so 1 in 5, and suicidality is 6%. In addition to that, as you can see on the left-hand side, we've got distress levels at 42%. So again, that goes to that statistic that we saw before, which is comparable then to the 2 in 5, having some form of distress, psychological distress. And distress, as opposed to stress, the dis is what you could think of as the bad side of stress, as opposed to eustress, which is when stress is good and positive. And I'll show you how that is the case. So quite concerning that almost 1 in 3 girls at Kincoppal, potentially, based off these statistics, already have anxiety now. 1 in 5 potentially have depression, and then about 1 in 20 have some form of suicide ideation. These are done on Year 8 students, as you can see, to give you an indication, but this is, as I said, a study done by Black Dog, so with an Australian population and over a series of years. As you can see, we don't have the statistics for ADHD and conduct disorder, and I'll talk to you again about what they are, but just to set up, if we're going off that 3-fold increase in the last 10 years alone, then ADHD for girls could be estimated at about 9%, so 1 in 10, or perhaps again 2 in every of your classes, and conduct disorder being about 6%. So that is the prevalence overall as to where we're at now for mental illness in young people. As you will already see, girls are quite overrepresented in each of these first 4, at least, types of mental illness and psychological distress. On the flip side, boys tend to be diagnosed, not necessarily having it, and we'll talk about that, but diagnosed at higher rates for ADHD and conduct disorder. And overall, what we found in the research is that girls are twice as likely to experience mental illness than boys. So again, another reason why we're looking into mental illness at Kincoppal and looking at how we can start thinking about the impact this is having on girls, particularly for you in the classroom, and what can be done about that. So to summarise, the most common mental illnesses in young people are anxiety, depression, ADHD, and conduct disorder. So now on to the importance of mental illness and why are we even learning about it and what's it got to do with you as teachers. Again, I'd like to put up some quotes or sentiments that I've heard, being privy to during my time as a psychologist, but also speaking to teachers. Things like, my student has anxiety but should sit the exam, or even should not sit the exam. So I guess that determining whether their mental illness does or does not impact their ability to function at school is just something to be mindful of. I would know if there is something wrong with my student. This one particularly is important to challenge, just because young people are less likely than any population to reach out for professional help. In 12 to 14-year-olds, this is as low as 30% that would rather deal with issues on their own. And for 15 to 17-year-olds, so in those higher ages at high school, 50% of them would deal with issues on their own and not reach out. Having a mental illness seems to be trendy at the moment. I guess the reality is, working as a psychologist, I can see just how untrendy it is. And I experience every day clients that don't want to have these mental illnesses, even though I think it can be sometimes glamorized and a bit of a trend or a fad. And that's the next one. Mental illnesses are just a fad, and kids should just get on with it and get over it. Again, I think a lot of them would do absolutely anything not to have these extra challenges that are placed on them and impacting things like their schoolwork. My students is always so smiley, so wouldn't assume they have a mental illness. This again, I think, just goes to, it's often very deceiving, and particularly those that are smiley, and I don't want to generalize, but those that are sometimes happier on the outside have a lot more demons on the inside going on. So just things to consider. In terms of busting some myths, mental illness is a sign of weakness or character flaw. Well, of course, it's not a reflection of their character. Not experienced by children, as we've seen it definitely is. Caused by bad parenting. It's not just caused by what we call bad parenting, although that can definitely impact, as we've just seen with the nurture, or impacts of bad nature impacts. It's not recoverable. It definitely is able to be managed and overcome with appropriate treatment. It's just a phase. Not the case, as we've seen, these can go and lifelong illnesses, but they are not, as I mentioned before, not wanted in the first place. So I don't think anyone that's having a mental illness really wants to have it. And something not to be spoken about, and that thought that if we talk about it, maybe we'll remind them of it. It's quite the opposite. In fact, it should be spoken about to alleviate not only the stigma, but also having that person to reach out to, or anyone, even one single adult or mentor or someone like yourselves as teachers, has a huge impact on relieving some of those internal issues that are going on. So stigma involves deficits overall in knowledge, attitudes, and behaviours. And you can see some examples under here, and I won't go through them. I guess the main reason why we're calling out the stigma is because this is why it's important to recognise and get past in order to then move forward and understand. And a big part of what we're doing today is, of course, that gaining the knowledge and to help impact then attitudes and resulting behaviours as to what happens in class. And how can it be overcome? Education. This is what we're looking at today, and how to bust some of those myths, and also overcome some of those inaccurate stereotypes and replace it with factual information, and also obviously help with empathy, and can be helped with empathy and really understanding what our young people and your students are going through. The impact of mental illness has obviously a lot of devastating outcomes, but in terms of short versus long-term impacts, things such as emotional, cognitive, and social development, difficulties in learning, concentration, and attention, which is obviously very relevant to the classroom and their impact at academic performance, and challenges in forming and maintaining relationships. In a longer term sense, things like delayed emotional maturity and reduced resilience, lower educational attainment, and then therefore limited opportunities post-school, and also withdrawal, increased risks of substance abuse and antisocial behaviours. So one to call out particularly relevant for you as teachers is the poor school performance, and just understanding just how detrimental mental illness can be on their academic performance. So for instance, the average number of absent school days in students for those with a mental disorder is 24 days. So that's 5 total weeks of school versus 2 weeks or 11 days for those without a mental disorder. The Year 9 students in Australia with the mental health disorder are also significantly behind in terms of academic years, with up to, as you can see, up to 3 years behind those with no mental disorder. So this is just good, I guess, to understand, again, the impact as to how high that, how great those impacts are on particularly the classroom, and just making sure that that's something that's at the forefront as to explaining, for example, absent days because of things like mental health illness days, seeing psychologists, psychiatrists, counsellors, etc., but then also the result as to where they're at and what they're actually been able to absorb and retain in the classroom and beyond. And just as I mentioned before, what are those devastating outcomes? We have covered this earlier on, but suicide and self-harm, how common is it? Well, it's the most common killer, the biggest killer of our young people in Australia, and it's the 3rd leading cause of premature death overall for all age groups. It's as common as 1 young person every single day in Australia taking their life. So to start with, our first sections of mental illnesses, we're going to look at stress and anxiety. And these two in particular are linked and often confused and used interchangeably. So I really want to draw out what actually they are and how they're different from each other.
We all get stressed at times, feeling concerned, worried, or nervous. Your students might feel tense, easily upset, or even overwhelmed. Stress is quite normal, and they need a bit of stress to motivate them. But it can cause them to freeze up if they have too much of it. Stress is a milder version of anxiety, which involves worrying about day-to-day things. Anxiety is more of a fixation on thoughts or feelings that are repetitive and even catastrophizing. Stress can feel constant and even never-ending, often with physical symptoms like a racing heart, nervousness, nausea, shakiness, and even sweating. The good news is that when stress occurs, you can help your students do many things to stop feeling overwhelmed and feeling unstuck in the classroom. Maximinds can teach you techniques to help you channel your student stress into positive and productive action. Anxiety is a scary, often overused and misunderstood concept. With anxiety, students may worry about the same thing over and over, consuming their life and always feeling on edge. Anxiety has physiological impacts affecting our body. We may feel hot and sweaty, jittery and nervous, have trouble breathing, and a quick heart rate. Anxiety is an extreme form of stress occurring over long periods of time. We all need a normal amount of stress to perform, but too much is when we have anxiety. Anxiety can be managed and dealt with, but must be professionally treated.
So now that you've seen those two videos on stress and anxiety, I wanted to just summarize and show you this page, which shows that curve again, which you've just seen, which along the x-axis has arousal, or think of that as energy, and on the y-axis has performance. And think of that, well, how's their output? As you can see, we all need an optimal amount of arousal. And what happens when we have a little bit too much is more stress. And sometimes that can be good stress, like that eustress that I mentioned before, as opposed to distress. Too much of that is where anxiety typically sits, because there's overactivity going on not only in the body physiologically but also mentally, which leads to anxiety. So I think that's one way to differentiate stress and anxiety quite simply. Further to that, in terms of stress and anxiety, if we look at the extremity of it, tends to be more mild, tends to be more situational, state-based, and less of those physiological symptoms in comparison to anxiety, which tends to be more severe, is more enduring and more trait-based, and has more of those physiological symptoms that we just had a look at in the videos. So how to actually define anxiety disorders, and again, this comes from the DSM, or the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness Disorders. So anxiety is any of a group of disorders that have as their central organizing theme the emotional state of fear, worry, or excessive apprehension. So those three things are really important. I'm just thinking about them. Fear, so there's actually something that they're scared of, children, or something genuinely to worry about, or excessive apprehension. So when there's too much of that arousal that we talk about. So what are the types of anxiety disorders? These are not an exhaustive list, but these are the most common ones, and we will be talking about a couple. So generalized anxiety disorders is, as it implies, it's more generalized. There's nothing necessarily specific. It could be everything from being scared of spiders to it could also be having that fear that's from not wanting to get in a red car, for example. So they're not necessarily isolated things that they're scared of, and therefore it's called generalized anxiety. Panic disorder, again, as it implies, is when there's that panic and those panic attacks, and when they're actually enduring over time. Again, disorder as opposed to just a single attack. It's got to be multiple attacks. Going along the top, agoraphobia, which means literally fear of the marketplace. So that's the fear of being in crowded places, in big shopping centres, potentially on buses or busy train stations. Going to the next row, we've got social phobia, which is being scared or having that fear of social encounters, potentially extreme levels. Think of this as extreme levels of almost introversion and not wanting to necessarily socialize, be in groups of people, not wanting to be outside and interacting in a public setting. Obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, which gets a lot of airtime, I think, and also misinformation, has to have those two components, obsessive and compulsive. So obsessive being a fixation, and compulsive being that repetitive over time. Separation anxiety, typically we see that in younger children, obviously as they're growing up, separation from parents it could be, or a certain place, not necessarily just people. Post-traumatic stress disorder, we mentioned that before, as implies, post a traumatic stress incident. We talked about that. It could be something even like a divorce, or it could be a significant actual event in a short period of time, for example, like an immediate car crash, and then having, as I mentioned before, that enduring fear, say, of going into red cars as a result of that, but then also having a lot more of those physiological symptoms that go with that, things like night terrors. And then something as part of anxiety disorders, not specifically from the DSM, but physical injury fears, do see that a lot, and rising, obviously because of things like COVID, which has really exacerbated things like OCD and that cleanliness and desire to wash hands still, avoid public places, be obsessive in that regard. But this is related specifically to having injuries themselves. So there, as I said, the types of anxiety disorders at high level, I see a lot of, and we see a lot with young people, generalized anxiety disorder, typically, because it's not necessarily isolated. And as I mentioned, increasingly more common are things around coming off the back of COVID has resulted in those other sorts of anxieties too. So symptoms of anxiety disorders at a high level: intrusive thoughts they will have, insomnia, trouble sleeping, not for you to have to obviously worry about at school, but just so you know, increased worry. Then you might see students sweating excessively. Again, it has to be above and beyond just scared or stressed ahead of, for example, a presentation. Again, nightmares and bad dreams, more for your knowledge. You may see more irritability and outbursts, but those emotional outbursts you're looking for in the classroom. Trembling and shaking, racing heart, and you can sort of see on their face if they have those physiological symptoms, and that's something to be mindful, which will differentiate typically anxiety from stress. Avoiding activities, that avoidance, because it will relieve that stress and severe anxiety. Dizziness and sweating without exercise. So these are the things that you can typically, that we typically feel when we have anxiety. When we look at next week's topic with warning signs, we're going to look into specific things that you can look out for as warning. But this is really to help you educate, but also help you empathize with what they would be feeling, for example, if they did have anxiety in your class. There are plenty of resources online on Maximinds as to how to deal specifically with stress and anxiety. You can take quizzes to help you assess whether you think those feelings are occurring in your students. You can watch more videos to to go over the difference between stress and anxiety, read articles on them, strategies, activities, and also the option to refer to a psychologist. So I won't give you an exhaustive list because, as you can see, you can go and access them yourselves, but I will give you one example of a strategy that I think's a really good general one for stress and anxiety, because it helps to ground back into reality, which, as we know, is about promoting mental health and limiting some of that illness. So in terms of an almost quick fix or immediate strategy, this is something that you could consider with those students that you suspect are stressed and or anxious.
Another tool teachers can use is by incorporating sensory engagement activities into their lessons to support students' well-being. By engaging their senses, such as identifying 5 things they can touch, 4 things they can see, 3 things they can hear, 2 things they can smell, and 1 thing they can taste, students are able to connect more deeply with their learning experiences. Sensory engagement helps students stay present, enhances their learning experience, and promotes their mental well-being.
So as you can see, that is an example of how you can help really quickly and easily students that are feeling stressed and anxious to ground themselves, refocus. Another activity you could give them is to help take off that overwhelming sense of stress, fear and worry that we explored in stress and anxiety by helping them to break things into bite-sized tasks. Again, it seems quite simple, but just really having it on paper makes it more objective for them to write them down, giving them something like this. You could even draw them out or getting them to think about how they can break things down, and spending that time to teach them something like this can help save them a lot of worry and angst, and also help with their results and doing things in a more methodical way, more rational for their studies. So now we'll move on to depression and depressive disorders. What I'll do is start by showing you a video of really what is depression. We refer to it as being down, and I'll play that for you now.
Students all feel down sometimes, but they might feel sad or flat for a prolonged period of time. They may start to lose interest in the things they used to enjoy, stop hanging out with their usual friends, or stop engaging in the classroom. They may feel miserable, empty, lonely, or worthless, and maybe even thinking about death at times. This is called depression, a severe mental illness. We may inherit depression from family, or it may come after a major life event like a death or end of relationship. You might feel guilty and ask yourself, have I not been paying more attention to them as I should? Do they have something going on that I should be aware of? But people with depression can have everything they need, like food and a home. But they start questioning what's next. Maximinds can help you find your student's purpose and the motivation to get going again. It's always important to remember that things will get better and there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
So again, that gives you a bit more of an overview from the perspective of the child to help with your empathizing with them and understanding. You may recall that we looked at the hierarchy of needs last week, and I think it really applies to depression, as it's sort of called out in that video around it's not necessarily that they don't have everything they need and there's a reason to be sad or flat or down, but actually it's because they're striving for more, and that sense of high achievement can actually also exacerbate feelings of depression. So how to actually define it, and again from the DSM, a negative affective state ranging from unhappiness and discontent to an extreme feeling of sadness, pessimism, and despondency that interferes with daily life. And again, that's really important, that clinically significant distress that we talked about earlier, interfering with actually how they function at school from your perspective. We will look specifically again at warning signs for you to look out for next week from more of a behavioural perspective, but at least to give you some sense of understanding of the impact of depression on their functioning, that daily functioning. Schoolwork, firstly, for those with no depression symptoms, have, as you can see, a significantly less impact on their schoolwork than those with depression symptoms, actually 3 times as much in schoolwork, also 3 times as much in joining activities, which we saw in the video around not wanting to do the same sorts of things they potentially wanted to, with hanging out with friends, doing extracurricular activities, and something as really basic as the daily self-care, which is hugely different to those with no depressive symptoms. And I think this is quite indicative of depression as distinct from other mental illnesses, is that difference in those daily basic minimal things, such as showering every day, having a clean uniform, for example, coming to school, tidying their hair, being able to keep their school books with them, come to class with what they need, those sorts of things. So there's some of the things for you to look out for. Again, to help empathize, the feelings that they will have as symptoms is typically that lack of energy, but you might also be able to notice that inability to concentrate, obviously something to look out for. Feeling of worthlessness, harder for you to interpret, but that's another key defining feature of depression. Weight loss or gain, so any sort of change in weight. Sleeping pattern disruptions, and again, you won't be able to tell how they sleep, but you might be able to see if they're, for example, constantly tired in class, and some sort of change in their energy levels. Feelings of extreme sadness or despair, you may see teariness, crying, leaving the classroom, and a loss of interest or pleasure in activities, and that keeps coming up. That change from what they normally like to do, they no longer want to. So there are a few types of depressive disorders. The major one we're going to talk about is major depressive disorder, which I'm calling for purposes of your information for you teachers, depression. Dysthymia, which is less intense but over a longer period of time. So I won't go too much into that one, but that's, like I said, it's less intense, less symptoms, but more enduring for over 2 years compared to a major depressive disorder, which can be as a minimum of 2 weeks. And then, again, more relevant for the parents than you as teachers, but the premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is PMS, frankly, and that is a disorder in the DSM. But as I said, we'll go just into depression and really show you what exactly the criteria looks like. So more things for you to be mindful at a high level: 5 or more of the below symptoms, which must include the first one, depressed mood most of the day, or diminished interest or pleasure in all or most activities. And so that's very clear. And so I think as teachers, yes, you can potentially see what their mood's like between days, between classes, but the key thing would be the diminished activities or changes to any sort of normal patterns of them behaving and interacting potentially with friends or extracurricular activities, things like that change. In addition to one of those, or at least 2 of those, there'll be another 3 to 4 criteria depending. As we mentioned, the weight changes, the sleep, and therefore the impact on how tired they might be in the classroom. Psychomotor agitation, so that's quite restlessness, or it could be being slowed down and quite slow. Fatigue or loss of energy, worthlessness, diminished ability to think or concentrate, also a bit tricky as we'll look into ADHD and how that differs, and recurrent thoughts of death and fear of dying. again, probably harder for you to pick up, but it could even be any sort of conversational fixation of death that's not necessarily about dying themselves, but just something to keep in mind. How common is this? Again, that same study that was done in 2013-14 found that half of all the mental health conditions have started by 14, and I think that's good to know in relation to particularly depression. 1 in 10 will self-harm for the high school years, the 12 to 17-year-olds. 1 in 13 will consider suicide, and 1 in 40 will attempt suicide. Obviously, this is quite a lot of very rich but very devastating outcomes that we don't often see, but the fact that 1 in 10 will at some stage self-harm is obviously a concern. Something else which is obviously uncomfortable to call out, but also using the fact that you get to see them every day, or at least a couple of times a week, as another way just to look out for those sorts of things. So as we already spoke about, the specific techniques, strategies online for depression for you to have access to, and also the ability to always refer to a psychologist. But what I will give you is a couple of techniques now.
As teachers, you can encourage students to reflect on their day using the glad, sad, and bin technique. Have them identify something that they're glad or happy about, something that made them sad or disappointed, and something they want to put in the bin, something they want to let go of or move on from. This reflective practice helps students focus on the positive aspects of the day, process negative experiences, and cultivate resilience for their mental well-being. As teachers,
another activity that you could do in your classrooms, if you are starting to notice any of those sorts of feelings of depression, are encouraging them to think about the things that they love about themselves. And I think this is a really good tool because it's very indicative of where they're at in terms of their own esteem and confidence, and I think happiness in themselves and therefore their world. You may find that they might not have anything to put down, and sometimes that can be more of a blocker at the start. But if you can then say, why don't you put one thing down and write down at least one thing each time. Again, girls will often say, I can't think of anything, but if you can help with that and write them down and almost use this as something to keep building upon, and that they can then save on their phone or have with them to always go back and look at. And I like the things I love about me is because we're often are told, particularly at school, you get reports and things like that, and they get a lot of feedback externally from teachers and parents and also peers, but really thinking to help them think about what they love about themselves particularly. So moving on to ADHD, attention deficit and hyperactive disorder. It is one of the 3 types of behaviour disorders. Alongside that is oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, and conduct disorder. And we will look at exactly what these are. I'm just going to start with a video that's coming soon to Maximize, and a whole new feeling that we've got, which is I'm feeling distracted, for the very point that we are hearing and seeing a huge amount more of focus on ADHD. And I will explain why that is after the video.
feeling distracted can pose a significant challenge for anyone, hindering their daily life. Distractions can manifest as difficulties in both focusing attention or experiencing hyperactivity and impulsiveness, or even a combination of both. If you find yourself more inattentive, you might notice tendencies to daydream, procrastinate, or being forgetful. On the other hand, if you lean towards hyperactivity or impulsiveness, you may find yourself fidgeting, feeling restless, or engaging in excessive talking. It's important to acknowledge that many people encounter these challenges, but for some, these distractions can significantly impact their daily lives and consume a considerable portion of their day. You might wonder why you struggle to focus unlike your friends or other kids. The good news is that Maximinds can provide you with tools and valuable tips to effectively manage distractions, raise self-awareness about your actions, and enhance your ability to concentrate when necessary.
As you can see, that's directed for students now because we are still in development of the parents and teachers, but want to give you an overview and now talk to what specifically ADHD is. So ADHD affects the brain's executive function, the ability to self-regulate and control thoughts, words, actions, and emotions. There's two specific bits of ADHD. So the first one's the inattention, and the second one is the H, the hyperactivity and impulsivity. And with ADHD, it can interfere in one of those or both of those. So there's different subtypes. So as we just learned about, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. Inattention disorganization's inability to stay on task, seeming not to listen, inconsistent with age or development level. But then hyperactivity is the overactivity, fidgeting, inability to stay seated, intruding on other people, excessive for, again, age or development level. So there has been the confusion over ADD versus ADHD. We actually now only use ADHD. We haven't used the ADD alone since I think the 1980s. So the confusion now with if you've got the H, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've got those hyperactive symptoms as well. You may have ADHD but without the H. So you may just be inattentive or disorganized. So some have both inattentive and some have hyperactive and impulsivity and some have both. So in terms of the diagnosis, ADHD is diagnosed in males at least twice the rate that's diagnosed in females, and not necessarily because more boys have it than girls, but because we're realizing that girls tend to compensate more in their behaviors and almost overcorrect, and boys typically demonstrate those obvious symptoms that we think of with ADHD, which is the fidgeting, the disruptive behavior, and the outbursts, whereas girls have more of those overly talkative, maybe, or the emotionally reactive. And so that's why there is a big emphasis now on diagnosis. And it used to be average age was 7, but now particularly more women are getting late diagnoses as a result of the growing awareness, but also the greater spectrum of symptoms that we're understanding that have different appearances in girls and boys. So that's really important to know for you as teachers of a girls' school, how that might play out. So even if they don't have necessarily a diagnosis, it is on the uptake. And the way we do it is based off the DSM criteria, is we give a diagnostic tool for the student to self-reflect, the parent as well, but also a trusted teacher. Say it might be one of you may have actually already done one of these for one of the King Koppel students. And so to collectively together, we can understand what's actually happening from their own perspective, what's happening at home, and also what is happening in the classroom. And as you'll see, there's, if you can see close enough, it has to also have had the symptoms when they were younger and children before the age of 12. So in the junior school typically, but also in the last 6 months. So it definitely comes upon and presents itself earlier, even though we've got this delay in the diagnosis of ADHD, particularly for girls. And I keep mentioning these other two behaviour disorders, oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. As you may recall, conduct disorder was one of the most common disorders, mental illness disorders. And what is it? So oppositional defiant is a repetitive, persistent pattern of defiant, obedient, or hostile behaviour. It's typically diagnosed when they're younger, and it's more things like irritability, argumentative, being defiant, and vindictive. As children get older, so now again more relevant for you as high school teachers, it can develop into conduct disorder, which is almost an extension and a more severe type of oppositional defiant disorder, but it involves more of a serious violation of basic rights of others, social norms, and rules. So it goes again above and beyond just what we talked about with that naughtiness before, or that defies social norms. This is more aggressive and violent, deceitful, disrespectful. I'm showing you this because it is statistically one of the common mental illnesses in girls, but that's not to say at all I would expect this to be in students at Kincoppal, but good for your information, and it may be that has come up in your work. Management and treatment is setting consistent expectations, limiting distractions, frequent feedback, rewards, breaks, tools and flexible rules, not overloading and encouraging support. It's obviously a hugely long list of things that you can be doing, but this is probably a start. And what is good is that we are developing those into comparable videos like you've already seen as specific tools that you can do those 1-minute strategies. And I will let you know when the distracted the distracted teacher resources are available for you to come soon. And last but not least, we have eating disorders. So how do we define eating disorders? Again, any disorder and last but not least is eating disorders. And how do we firstly define eating disorders? Again, we're drawing from the DSM definition, which is any disorder characterised primarily by a pathological disturbance of attitudes and behaviours related to food. So what are the sorts of symptoms that denote eating disorders? Well, it's a pathological disturbance related to food, struggles to eat in front of others, obsessive thoughts about food, weight, or eating, develop rigid rituals or rules around eating, and purging. In terms of the statistics, 32% of Australian adolescents currently engage in disordered eating. And just to be clear, this does not necessarily mean they have an eating disorder. As we can see on the right-hand side, 4% currently have an eating disorder in Australia, and 9% in their lifetime will have an eating disorder. Those statistics are general population because it is very hard to capture the youth and what does that look like, particularly in high school. It is very underreported, but I suspected it would be somewhere between that range. It's twice as common in girls as it is boys, as we can see in the middle there. So what are the types of eating disorders? The first and most common one is binge eating disorder. And I will give you a definition according to the DSM next on that. Bulimia and anorexia, which you are probably most familiar with. Anorexia and bulimia, they seem to be the ones that are more glamorized, if you will, in media and seem to be more front of mind, despite being less common, as you could see. In terms of these statistics, of those that have an eating disorder, 47% of those are the binge eating ones. Of those that have an eating disorder, 12% have bulimia, and of those that have an eating disorder, 3% have anorexia. So as promised, what is actually binge eating defined? How is it defined in the DSM? As you can see, it's episodes of binge eating, which is characterized by both of the following. So it must be eating in a discrete period of time and a sense of lack of control over eating. I've highlighted the lack of control because we have spoken about the importance of a sense of control and agency as being very important that we see at Maximinds, but also, as you can see, is a bit of a theme throughout mental disorder illness definitions. That sense of control being very important for mental well-being. And the reverse, the absence of mental illness, more likely when there's a greater sense of control and agency. So the binge eating episodes are associated by 3 or more of eating more rapidly than normal, eating after feeling uncomfortably full, not actually feeling physically hungry, eating alone because of not wanting to be around other people, and feeling potentially disgusted with oneself, depressed or guilty. There has to be a marked distress, and we spoke about that marked distress in terms of being for the individual psychological distress, but also the clinically significant distress in terms of it becomes impactful on their lives and their functioning. And it must occur for, on average, at least once a week for 3 months. As teachers, how is this relevant for you? The key things for you would be changes, looking for changes, particularly in weight, diet, exercise, and appearance. So PDHPE teachers, this might be particularly more heightened for you in terms of the exercise, but also you as pastoral care teachers knowing about what they're engaging in, as extracurricular with exercise. Are they doing more, for example, netball, or becoming more obsessed with running, for example, but also being able to see that change. And it is hard to spot on a day-to-day basis if you see them, but really almost reflecting between terms to see, is there something that's noticeably different? I'd listen to that gut that might recognize that. The last one, particularly with appearance, I think this is one of the best indicators, particularly for teenage girls in eating disorders, because they become more fixated with their appearance, and you will see, I'd say, more makeup and those, heavy eyes and things at school, when they're having some sort of, different relationship with themselves and how they see their self-identity. So that's a clear indicator. Why do we have eating disorders? And this is really Maximine's theory on this, and my experience with working with quite a few young girls with eating disorders. Definitely maps onto perfectionism and that sense of wanting everything to be just so, and it can come almost obsessive in that tendency when they apply that to themselves. Again, the feeling out of control, which we continuously talk about, really particularly with eating and eating disorders, because eating is something that we have to do almost 3 times a day, and plus with school, with recess and lunch, it's part of a structured day, but it's actually something that they can exert their own control and influence of to a great extent, particularly if they're at school and mum and dad are not putting food necessarily in front of them at breakfast and dinner. So just more things to be mindful with, being in the playground, noticing if you are on lunchtime duty, for example, just noticing if there's any things that you can pick up in terms of those eating habits there. Particularly, I forgot my lunch, I don't have this, or I've already eaten on this, all those sorts of excuses that they might come up with. Why? It's also linked to 2 types, particularly of anxiety. OCD I touched on before because of that obsessiveness, but also social anxiety. And it has had, there has been studies and evidence to suggest that social anxiety can then become extrapolated and lead into things like eating disorders. And as I mentioned before, things like makeup, more obsessive with appearance, their own appearance, can be ultimately rooted in self-consciousness. We know that adolescent girls are the most exposed and potentially have the threat of eating disorders because of that constant comparison to their peers as they go through puberty and bodies change and things like that. So I do want to show you an example of what is self-consciousness and how that particularly links to you.
Self-consciousness is about feeling embarrassed, ashamed, stupid, or judged. It involves a lot of guessing about ourselves, about how others see us, and why we feel the need to please others first. Students may start to doubt themselves and question their sense of self, which can limit their ability to achieve their full potential. They are constantly looking for validation from you or their peers. Their confidence drops because they make assumptions which often only exist in their minds. This can be normal, especially among young people who are finding their way in the world. Maximinds can give you the skills to show your students how to please and validate themselves first in order to ultimately build their sense of self, self-esteem, and self-confidence.
So that brings us to the end. We will summarise by going over what did we learn today. So to start with, mental illness affects almost 40% of young people, so 2 in 5, and that's expected to reach 3 in 5 or 60% by 2030. So it will be more common than not, unfortunately, in the coming years. There are many types of mental illness disorders. There's emotion ones related to anxiety and depression, behavioural, including ADHD and conduct disorder, and eating, mainly binge eating, but also bulimia and anorexia. Most common in girls is anxiety, depression, ADHD, and conduct disorders. And I believe, from personal experience and the trends that we can see, eating disorders are increasingly prevalent amongst young girls. To summarise, if you can answer, please, a few quick questions by scanning the QR code. There are only a few, just to reflect on what you have learnt today. Hopefully something. The main question is around whether you do believe you now have a greater ability of understanding mental illness and how it relates to young people. So if you could reflect on that, and I'll just give you a couple of seconds to do so, please. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. And of course, any feedback you have for what you would like to hear going forward, always can reach out to me beyond those feedback. So resources as to where to go from here, a reminder of your emergency contacts. Maximinds has that 24/7 access. You have all got access to that, and I hope you're making use of that free access you do have for 3 months. That is where all of these strategies and extra tools that you can have to use and download and help you in real time in the classroom are available. And again, my details, if you would like to reach out, any thoughts, feedback, anything you would like to hear, particularly in the coming webinar topics. Next week is on warning signs, so I look forward to seeing you then, and thank you all for joining.